September 19, 1944. The fields near Arracourt in eastern France lay heavy with morning fog. Dew clung to the grass, muffling the sound of advancing machines. Through the gray curtain, German crews of the 113th Panzer Brigade strained their eyes. Somewhere ahead, beyond the hedgerows and the faint outlines of farmhouses, enemy armor was waiting. But what kind of armor? They could not yet tell. Engines rumbled low. The big Panther tanks, fresh from factories in Germany, rolled forward with confidence. Each one weighed nearly 45 tons, each carried the fearsome 75mm high-velocity gun that had humbled so many Allied tanks in the past. The German tankers knew their weapons, they trusted their armor, and they believed that enemy tank destroyers, whatever types might be present, would be cumbersome, slow targets. That was what doctrine had taught them. That was what 4 years of combat had proven true. And then, a sound unlike anything they had ever heard. Not the deep roar of a Maybach engine. Not the sputter of an American Sherman. This was a high-pitched whine, thin, insistent, and oddly familiar, as though an aircraft were circling low over the battlefield. But there was no plane. Instead, through the shifting fog, silhouettes appeared. Small, low to the ground, moving at impossible speed. Their turrets snapped to targets with eerie precision. Fire flashed, shells slammed into Panther armor, and before a German gunner could even traverse his turret, the mysterious shapes were gone, slipping back into the mist. In minutes, tanks that should have dominated the field were burning. The German crews, stunned, realized they faced something utterly outside their recognition manuals. A machine that didn't fight like a fortress but like a ghost. A machine that could appear, strike, and vanish before they could even react. That morning, many German tankers of the 113th Panzer Brigade learned a truth that would haunt them for the rest of the war. The Americans had unleashed a tank destroyer capable of 55 miles per hour, faster than any tracked combat vehicle the world had ever seen. It was called the M18 Hellcat, and it was rewriting the rules of armored warfare. Why did the United States build such a machine? How did speed become a substitute for armor? And why were German forces, famed for innovation, caught so completely off guard? Over the next hour, we'll explore the story of the Hellcat, its design, its battles, its psychological impact, and its enduring influence on modern military thought. We'll walk the killing fields of Lorraine, the fog-shrouded crossroads of the Ardennes, and even the mountain passes of Italy, where the Hellcat's mobility became legend. We'll hear from veterans, examine German reports, and uncover how this machine turned fear into a weapon more powerful than steel. So, if you love history that comes alive, stories of innovation, courage, and the clash of doctrines, make sure you stay with us. And before we dive in, don't forget, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden stories of World War II. Like the video if you want to see more rare perspectives, and leave a comment sharing what fascinates you most about the Hellcat or the battles of 1944. Your support helps us bring more history, more voices, and more forgotten lessons back into the light. Because sometimes, history is not just about the strongest or the heaviest. Sometimes it's about the fastest. And in 1944, German tankers discovered that lesson the hard way. The story of the Hellcat does not begin in the fog of Lorraine, or even in the factories of Buick. It begins in December 1941, only days after the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into the Second World War. In a dimly lit conference room in Washington, officers of the War Department pored over maps and reports that painted a sobering picture. Europe had been convulsed by German blitzkrieg, and the Wehrmacht had shown the world that tanks, when used with speed and mass, could collapse nations in weeks. Poland had fallen in little more than a month. France, despite possessing the largest standing army in Europe, had crumbled in just 6 weeks. Britain had survived only because of the Channel, and even the mighty Soviet Union was reeling, its cities under siege, its armies encircled. Everywhere the pattern was the same. Heavily fortified defensive lines shattered under the hammer blow of German armored thrusts. Concrete and fixed guns could not stop tanks that bypassed, encircled, and struck deep into the rear. American officers, watching from across the Atlantic, understood the lesson with chilling clarity. If the United States simply built tanks as Germany had, if it tried to match ton for ton and gun for gun, it would always be behind. The country had come late into the war, it could not afford to merely imitate. It would need a different answer, one that exploited America's unique strengths: vast industry, automotive expertise, and a tradition of mobility rooted in the cavalry. One officer in particular carried this vision forward. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, a cavalryman by training, believed that tanks were not merely machines of armor and firepower, they were instruments of maneuver, heirs to the horse-mounted traditions of striking fast and disappearing before the enemy could respond. In a classified briefing that December, Bruce proposed something radical. A new force not of heavy tanks meant to grind slowly against the enemy, but of tank destroyers, vehicles built not to endure punishment, but to hunt enemy armor with speed and guile. Their motto would be simple, almost stark: seek, strike, destroy. To many this sounded reckless. Could a vehicle with light armor, perhaps no heavier than a truck, really take on the dreaded German panzers? Was it not suicidal to ask crews to fight without the security of thick steel? Yet Bruce argued that armor was not the only protection. Speed itself could be a shield. A tank that could move swiftly, reposition constantly, and strike from unexpected angles would be far harder to hit than a lumbering fortress. And in war, what cannot be hit cannot be killed. As the Ordnance Department translated Bruce's ideas into specifications, engineers faced daunting challenges. The first designs called for small guns, 37 mm at first, then 57, then 75. Each quickly became obsolete as German armor grew tougher. By 1942, the demand rose for a weapon mounting a 76 mm gun, a caliber capable of piercing the side armor of even a Panther. But the greater challenge was not the gun, it was the mobility. The designers at Buick Motor Division were tasked with building something that almost defied physics. A tracked vehicle that could move faster than anything the Germans fielded, yet remain light enough to mass-produce and reliable enough to survive in mud, snow, and shattered roads. They experimented with suspensions, engines, and transmissions, discarding what was too heavy or too fragile. In April 1943, their prototype, known as the T-70, rolled out for tests. What observers saw astonished them. This 17-ton vehicle accelerated like a car. It roared down roads at speeds exceeding 50 miles an hour. Soldiers watching the trials described it as a tank on wings. German intelligence, when whispers of this project reached them, scoffed. To Wehrmacht officers steeped in doctrine, the idea seemed absurd. Real tank destroyers, they believed, were exemplified by their own Jag Panther or Elephant, machines of 40 or even 70 tons, armed with 88 mm cannons, armored thick enough to shrug off hits. A 17-ton open-topped vehicle with armor no thicker than a man's hand? To them it looked like naivety, not innovation. But the Americans were thinking in different dimensions. Where the Germans had built castles of steel, the Americans built a predator that would never sit still. Where the Germans relied on armor to endure, the Americans relied on motion to evade. It was a philosophy born not from desperation, but from a shrewd calculation. In an industrial war, speed and adaptability might matter more than sheer mass. The crews who would eventually man these vehicles were trained with that same philosophy. At Camp Hood in Texas, where the Tank Destroyer Center was established, recruits were taught a doctrine entirely separate from the armored divisions. They learned to think like hunters. Drivers practiced high-speed maneuvering, slamming through curves, accelerating and braking on command, keeping control even as dust blinded their vision. Gunners drilled in rapid acquisition, firing not carefully aimed long-range shots, but quick, decisive salvos at moderate distances. Commanders were taught to plan not one firing position, but 3 in advance: engage, fall back, reappear. Every exercise hammered in the same truth: their armor could not save them, only their speed, their awareness, and their nerve. Yet this doctrine remained untested in the crucible of large-scale battle. Many American commanders doubted whether lightly armored tank destroyers could survive against German panzers. Even within the U.S. Army there was debate. Shouldn't the tank itself, like the Sherman, be the true tank killer? Wasn't the whole concept of a separate tank destroyer branch a gamble? The answer would come only on the battlefield. And when it did, in the fields of Italy and France, the Hellcat would prove that sometimes audacity is its own form of protection. The crucible of Italy provided the first real test for America's new doctrine. By early 1944, Allied armies had been fighting up the mountainous spine of the peninsula for months, clawing their way past the Gustav Line, Monte Cassino, and countless fortified ridges. For tankers, the terrain was a nightmare: narrow valleys, steep hills, winding roads. It was a battlefield that seemed designed to negate the very advantages the Hellcat had been built for. And yet, it was here that the Germans first felt the sting of the M18. The baptism came during the Anzio breakout in May 1944. After months bottled up on the beachhead, American and British forces surged forward to crack the German defenses. Among the units committed was the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, a formation that had earned a grim reputation from Sicily to Italy. Its Panzer IVs, supported by assault guns and infantry, pressed hard against the advancing Americans. Into this maelstrom roared a handful of newly issued M18s. At first, German crews did not know what they were facing. Their recognition manuals contained silhouettes of Shermans, Stuarts, and half-tracks, but nothing like these low-slung, darting machines. When the Hellcats opened fire, their 76mm guns cracked across the fields, and two Panzer IVs burst into flames within minutes. The American crews immediately displaced, engines screaming, vanishing behind hedgerows before the German gunners could respond. Reports from the Hermann Göring Division's daily log recorded the encounter with puzzlement. Enemy employs new tank destroyer type. Vehicle speed estimated at 70 to 80 km per hour. Two Panzer IVs destroyed before enemy withdrew. Return fire ineffective due to rapid movement. The tone was almost incredulous, as though the writers themselves doubted what their eyes had seen. Those reports climbed the chain of command, reaching the desks of Corps and Army headquarters. In Berlin, when intelligence officers summarized the accounts, they filed them as unconfirmed, likely exaggerated. Surely, they reasoned, no tracked vehicle could move that fast. Surely combat-stressed crews were mistaking ordinary tanks for something else, or overestimating speeds in the chaos of battle. But more reports trickled in. By the summer of 1944, multiple German formations along the Italian front had mentioned these strange, fast-moving American machines. One officer, skeptical of the accounts, visited the front to interrogate his own tankers. He asked them directly, "Did you mistake a half-track for a tank destroyer?" The reply was firm, "No, Herr Oberst. These were tracked. They carried guns like Shermans, but they ran like cars." For the American crews, these first engagements were both terrifying and exhilarating. The open turret gave them a panoramic view but left them vulnerable to every mortar fragment and sniper's bullet. The thin armor meant even a 20mm autocannon could be deadly. Yet the sheer speed of the Hellcat filled them with confidence. Many described it as if the machine itself had wings. One gunner recalled, "When you put the throttle down you felt untouchable. Like the Germans could never pin you down. We were in a tin can, but it was a tin can that flew." Still, Italy was not ideal terrain for the Hellcat. The mountains and narrow roads limited maneuvering, and German infantry with Panzerfausts lurked behind every wall. The M18s were often forced into roles that their designers had not envisioned, supporting infantry assaults, blasting bunkers, or guarding roads. In such situations their thin armor was a liability. Losses mounted, though crews often survived by bailing out quickly once hit. Yet every time the terrain opened, every time there was a valley, a plain, or even a wide road, the Hellcats showed what they could do. They could redeploy from one threatened sector to another faster than any German tank. They could strike and vanish before Panthers and Tigers could even traverse their turrets. And they left German commanders with a growing unease. The Americans had created something different, something outside the expected grammar of armored warfare. The real revelation, however, was yet to come. It would not happen in the hills of Italy but in the foggy fields of France. By September 1944, the Allies had broken out of Normandy and swept across much of France. Patton's Third Army surged eastward, hungry for the borders of Germany itself. To stop this advance, Hitler ordered a counteroffensive in Lorraine. Fresh units, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, were thrown into the line, equipped with brand new Panthers straight from the factories. German commanders were confident. The Panther was their masterpiece, with sloped armor, a powerful 75mm gun, and enough firepower to dominate the Sherman. Against these steel predators, what chance would lightly armored American tank destroyers have? The stage was set for one of the most remarkable encounters of the war, the Battle of Arracourt. It was here, in the gray dawn of September 19, 1944, that the Hellcat would reveal its full potential, not in isolated skirmishes but in a pitched battle against the best Germany could field. That morning, heavy fog blanketed the Lorraine countryside. German Panthers of the 113th Brigade advanced cautiously, their engines growling, their commanders peering into the mist. They expected to clash with Shermans, perhaps dug-in infantry, maybe some artillery. What they did not expect was to hear a high-pitched whine, unlike any tank engine they had known, closer to the sound of an aircraft than a vehicle. Out of the fog, low silhouettes appeared, fired rapid salvos, and then melted back into the gray. 3 Panthers fell in minutes. The German gunners tried to respond, swinging their heavy turrets, but the targets were already gone. Again and again the pattern repeated. The Panthers lumbered forward, only to be struck from unseen angles. Within hours, dozens of them were burning, their crews abandoning machines that had been touted as invincible. For the first time, German tankers confronted the full truth. The Americans had built a tank destroyer that could run at speeds they had believed impossible, up to 88 kilometers per hour on roads. The doctrine of deliberate, methodical armored duels no longer applied. They were being hunted by phantoms that refused to stand still, that refused to fight on German terms. The Hellcat had arrived, not as a curiosity, but as a battlefield force that would haunt the German Panzerwaffe until the war's end. The Battle of Arracourt remains one of the most astonishing episodes of armored combat in World War II, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because of the radical mismatch between expectation and reality. On the morning of September 19, 1944, the German 113th Panzer Brigade pressed forward under cover of a heavy Lorraine fog. To their commanders the plan seemed sound. The Panthers were technologically superior to the American Sherman. They had thicker armor, longer-ranged guns, and crews drilled in the art of tank warfare. The fog, they believed, would give them surprise and mask their approach. If all went according to plan, they would smash through Patton's overstretched lines and reclaim the initiative. But in that same fog, the men of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion lay in wait. Their vehicles, the M18 Hellcats, were not designed for slugging matches. They were not supposed to withstand frontal duels against Panthers. Instead, their commanders emphasized something different. Strike fast, strike hard, then move before the enemy can react. Lieutenant Edwin Leeper, commanding one of the M18 platoons, had briefed his crews with simple instructions: don't stay put. Don't wait for them to aim back. Fire, then shift, always shift. His men listened carefully. They knew their survival depended not on armor but on speed and nerve. At 6:20 a.m., the lead elements of the German force collided with Leeper's platoon. Out of the mist, the Panthers appeared, hulking, dark shapes, their long guns probing for targets. The Hellcats opened fire at ranges between 400 and 800 yards. Shells pierced German armor, igniting fuel and ammunition. 3 Panthers were destroyed within minutes. Before the surviving tanks could even traverse their turrets, the Hellcats were gone, engines screaming as they displaced to new firing positions. The entire exchange took no more than 20 seconds. For the German crews, the experience was surreal. They had trained for methodical gunnery duels, where seconds were measured carefully as they adjusted optics and dialed in range. But here, before they had even settled on targets, their comrades were burning, and the enemy had vanished. Throughout the morning, this deadly rhythm repeated. Hellcats would appear briefly through the fog, fire a handful of shots, and then melt away. German tankers swung their heavy turrets desperately, but the targets were always moving, always shifting. The Panther's turret, dependent on engine revolutions, could take up to a full minute to rotate completely. The Hellcat's hydraulics, by contrast, completed a full turn in just 24 seconds, independent of engine power. Mathematically, the mismatch was devastating. At 55 miles per hour, a Hellcat could cover 400 meters in just 16 seconds. A Panther, trying to track it, often needed more than 30 seconds just to swing its gun into the right arc. In those extra seconds, the M18S had already changed position, rendering the Panther's aim useless. Sergeant Henry R. Hartman, positioned on the flank, delivered one of the morning's most extraordinary performances. His gunner, cool under pressure, knocked out 6 Panthers in rapid succession. Each time, Hartman ordered a shift, the vehicle leaping backwards or sideways through the fog, only to reappear moments later from another angle. German tankers, disoriented and furious, found themselves trapped in a dance where they were always a step behind. By midday, the 113th Panzer Brigade was in crisis. In just hours of fighting, they had lost 39 tanks destroyed and 11 damaged. Staggering losses for a unit that had entered the field with pride and confidence. American losses? Just a handful of vehicles, 3 or 4 at most. For the Germans who had expected to roll over a retreating foe, the shock was profound. The after-action reports captured their disbelief. German officers wrote of enemy vehicles with unprecedented mobility, estimating speeds of over 80 kilometers per hour. Some even refused to believe the numbers, dismissing them as combat exaggerations. Yet the wreckage littering the fields told another story. Something new had entered the war, something that defied every assumption about how tanks and tank destroyers should fight. The Americans, meanwhile, studied the battle with equal care. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's after-action report spelled out the tactics in stark language. Engagement sequence: fire 3 to 5 rounds from concealed position. Immediately displace minimum 200 yards. Re-engage from new position at different angle. Never remain stationary under enemy observation longer than 60 seconds. This doctrine, dubbed shoot and scoot, became the mantra of Hellcat crews. They were not there to slug it out with German armor. They were there to harass, confuse, and ultimately dismantle enemy formations by exploiting their speed advantage. Against Panthers, the philosophy worked with ruthless efficiency. To the men who fought that day, the memory lingered. One American crewman later recalled, "It was like fighting shadows. We weren't the ones in shadows, they were. Every time they thought they had us, we were already gone. Their tanks looked mighty, but they moved like they were stuck in glue. We felt like we were flying." The Battle of Arracourt did not end on September 19th. 4 days, German brigades attempted to regain momentum, hurling their Panthers against American defenses. But again and again the Hellcats appeared, firing from hidden positions, darting through fog and vanishing before a counterstrike could be mounted. By the time the fighting subsided, the newly formed German brigades were shattered. Their promise of restoring the front line had evaporated in smoke and wreckage. For German tank crews, the encounter was demoralizing. They had entered the battlefield with confidence in their machines, only to be humiliated by opponents they could rarely pin down. For American crews, the battle was vindication, a proof that their risky doctrine of speed over armor could succeed even against Germany's best tanks. Yet Arracourt was not merely a tactical victory. It was a psychological turning point. German crews, once accustomed to dictating terms of engagement, now found themselves reacting, always reacting, to an enemy that refused to fight their way. And that loss of initiative, that loss of certainty, carried consequences far beyond a single battlefield. By the end of September 1944, the reputation of the Hellcat had already begun to spread among American units. Stories circulated of Panthers destroyed in fog, of tank destroyers racing like cavalry across fields, of German crews stunned into disbelief. But the M18's legend was not sealed in Lorraine. That would come later, in the frozen forests of Belgium, during Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes. Panzer divisions, bolstered by elite SS units, smashed into thin American lines. Snow fell thick and fog grounded Allied aircraft. 4 days, chaos reigned as roads clogged with retreating columns, artillery pounded crossroads, and German armored spearheads pushed deeper toward Antwerp. At the heart of this struggle lay the crossroads town of Bastogne. To reach it, German forces needed to capture nearby villages, including Neuville, a small settlement perched on a ridge. Holding it was crucial to sealing off Bastogne's defenders. And it was here that the Hellcat once again revealed its strange magic. On December 19th, 4 M18s from the 609th and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions were ordered to support elements of the 101st Airborne Division. Their task: hold Neuville against overwhelming odds until reinforcements could arrive. On paper it was madness. The Germans had the 2nd Panzer Division, hardened veterans with dozens of tanks and assault guns. The Americans had paratroopers, artillery, and just 4 thinly armored Hellcats. The morning fog that had concealed German movements also worked in the Hellcat's favor. As the Panthers and Panzer IVs probed forward, the M18s unleashed their guns, then immediately darted backward into the mist. Engines howled, treads kicked up snow, and the Germans found themselves chasing ghosts. To the attackers, it seemed as though there were far more than 4 American tank destroyers. Every time they swung their turrets toward muzzle flashes, the targets were already gone, firing again from a different angle. A combat report from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion described the tactics with understated precision. Four M18s engaged elements of 2nd Panzer Division in fog conditions. High-speed displacement between firing positions created impression of larger defensive force. Confirmed destroyed 24 enemy tanks. M18 losses, 1 vehicle to artillery. The numbers were staggering. 24 German tanks knocked out by just 4 Hellcats, with only a single American loss. But the statistics tell only part of the story. The real impact was time. The German advance stalled for nearly 2 days. Those 48 hours gave the 101st Airborne precious breathing space to fortify Bastogne, a delay that would prove decisive when the town came under siege. German records from the 2nd Panzer Division revealed their frustration. Encountered strong tank destroyer resistance at Neuville. Enemy vehicles of high mobility operating in fog. Unable to effectively engage due to rapid displacement. Attack suspended pending reinforcement. The language echoed earlier reports from Italy and Lorraine. Once again, German tankers faced opponents who refused to stand still, who turned every engagement into a blur of motion and vanished silhouettes. For the American crews, the experience was harrowing. The cold bit into their exposed faces inside the open turrets. Snow and ice clung to their uniforms. Mortar rounds and artillery shells rained down. Yet they pressed the throttles, trusting the Hellcat's speed more than its armor. Private First Class Robert Chin later recalled, "Every time I climbed into our M18, I knew I was sitting in a tin can. But it was a tin can that could run 55 miles an hour. That speed saved my life more times than any armor could have." The battle for Bastogne became legendary thanks to the stubborn defense of the 101st Airborne. Yet few remember that part of that defense rested on the shoulders of a handful of Hellcat crews. Without their delaying action at Neuville, the German armor might have reached Bastogne's gates before the town could be fortified. Instead, they arrived too late, their momentum blunted by an enemy they could not pin down. The Ardennes fighting revealed another dimension of the Hellcat's role: psychological warfare. German tankers, already confident in their machines, suddenly found themselves doubting. Was that muzzle flash the only enemy, or were there more waiting behind the ridge? Was that single Hellcat actually part of a platoon? Every hesitation, every moment of uncertainty bought the Americans more time. Speed was not just survival, it was deception, a weapon that multiplied the Hellcat's actual numbers. By January 1945, as the German offensive collapsed, the Hellcats had earned a reputation as hunters that could turn even the strongest armor into prey. But the victories came at a cost. The thin armor meant that every hit was deadly to the vehicle and losses mounted. Still, the kill-to-loss ratio remained in America's favor. In Europe, M18-equipped battalions achieved a ratio of roughly 2.3 enemy tanks destroyed for every Hellcat lost. Respectable, though far from invulnerability. The statistics, however, do not capture the true essence of the M18. Numbers alone cannot explain why German tankers feared it, why American crews trusted it, or why battles like Neuville shaped the course of larger campaigns. To understand that, one must look beyond steel and into the philosophy behind the machine. A philosophy that said armor was not protection but a trap. That said mobility could be lethality. That dared to make war not about who had the thicker plates, but who could move, fire, and vanish first. And in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, that philosophy held back Hitler's last offensive. By the winter of 1944, German commanders could no longer dismiss the reports about the strange American tank destroyer. The battlefield had forced acknowledgement. From Anzio to Arracourt to Neuville, the pattern repeated: fast, elusive vehicles that refused to fight by German rules, striking from nowhere and vanishing before a counterblow could land. General Otto von Manschufel, a veteran commander of the Panzerwaffe, issued tactical guidance to his 5th Panzer Army. His orders reflected both frustration and resignation. Enemy M18 tank destroyers confirmed capable of 80 km per hour road speed, 40 km cross-country. Standard engagement procedures must be modified. Do not attempt to track moving M18 with turret traverse. Preposition turrets on likely displacement routes. Employ infantry with Panzerfausts on flanks. Use artillery to suppress suspected positions. Avoid pursuit. M18s will always outrun our vehicles. On paper, the advice was sound. In practice, it proved nearly impossible to enforce. German training had conditioned crews for deliberate, long-range gunnery duels. Their optics were superb, their gunners disciplined, their doctrine refined over years of combat. But that very precision became a weakness when facing an enemy who refused to sit still. Hellcats did not wait for perfect ranges or textbook firing conditions. They fired quickly, accepted lower first-shot accuracy, and compensated with speed and volume. Technological limitations compounded the problem. German turret traverse systems relied on engine revolutions. At idle or low throttle, the turret crawled, sometimes taking nearly a full minute to rotate 360 degrees. Against a fast-moving Hellcat, that delay was fatal. By contrast, the M18's hydraulic system rotated a full circle in just 24 seconds, regardless of engine power. It was not the most heavily armed vehicle on the battlefield, but it was among the most responsive. Even when German crews tried to adapt, their machines betrayed them. The Panther, for all its reputation, was mechanically temperamental. Its final drives and transmissions often failed under stress, particularly during rapid maneuvers. The Tiger II, though formidable in firepower, was even slower, a lumbering fortress that struggled on narrow roads or soft ground. When faced with Hellcats darting like hornets, these mighty predators seemed clumsy. The Luftwaffe might have provided a counter through air power, but by late 1944 German skies were dominated by Allied fighters. Artillery too was theoretically an answer, saturating suspected Hellcat positions with shells. Yet the Americans understood this danger. Doctrine required Hellcats to move within 60 seconds of being spotted. By the time German guns fired, the targets were already gone. Infantry with Panzerfaust could ambush the M18, and many did. The open-top design made the vehicle vulnerable in cities or forests. A single well-placed shot or grenade could end the fight instantly. But for infantry to get close, the Hellcat had to slow down, and its crews avoided such situations whenever possible. In open country where speed was unconstrained, the advantage remained firmly with the Americans. All of this bred a psychological toll. German tankers had once dominated the battlefield with confidence. They had cut through Poland, France, and Russia with a sense of invincibility. But now, in the West, they were stalked by opponents who outpaced them, who struck from angles they could not cover, who reduced their mighty machines to burning wrecks before they could respond. One Panther commander later admitted in an interrogation, "We did not understand how they could move so fast. We thought only wheeled cars could reach such speeds, but these were tanks with real guns. When we turned to fire, they were already gone." His words capture the bewilderment of a force unprepared for such a radical departure from armored norms. For American crews, the very thinness of their armor was both a curse and a strange kind of blessing. They knew that one solid hit meant destruction. There was no illusion of safety. This sharpened their instincts. Hellcat crews were constantly alert, scanning for ambushes, thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead, never lingering. The vulnerability forced them into hyper-awareness, a mental edge that complemented their machine's speed. At the same time, the open turret created a bond between man and environment. Unlike tankers sealed inside steel coffins, Hellcat crews saw the battlefield directly. They could smell the smoke, feel the wind, and sense terrain changes with uncanny immediacy. This exposure was dangerous. Artillery fragments, snipers, even machine gun fire could prove lethal, but it gave them unparalleled situational awareness. Many veterans later said that they could never imagine fighting blind, like the crews of heavier tanks. Production numbers revealed another story. The Buick Motor Division, responsible for the M18, produced just over 2,500 units between mid-1943 and late 1944. Compared to the tens of thousands of Shermans, the Hellcat was always a minority player. Its doctrine, too, was controversial. The U.S. Army's tank destroyer concept had envisioned massed enemy armored thrusts, against which specialized units would counterattack. But in reality, such massive clashes were rare. Hellcats often found themselves supporting infantry, firing high-explosive shells at bunkers, or providing mobile artillery. In these roles, their thin armor and open tops made them vulnerable, and some commanders questioned whether the vehicle was a luxury rather than a necessity. Yet in the moments when German armor did appear in strength, Arracourt, Noville, countless smaller encounters, the Hellcat justified itself. Its kill-to-loss ratios were respectable, its tactical impact undeniable. More importantly, it represented a distinctly American approach, using industrial innovation not to copy German designs but to sidestep them. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed on the Rhine and pushed into Germany itself, Hellcats roamed the front like wolves. Their crews had grown seasoned, their doctrine refined through experience. They knew when to strike, when to retreat, when to gamble speed for position. In city fighting they remained cautious, often avoiding the rubble-strewn streets where Panzerfaust teams lurked. But in open country they continued to embarrass German tankers, picking off stragglers, ambushing convoys and racing ahead to block crossroads. For the Germans, no miracle counter ever arrived. Their industrial capacity was collapsing, fuel was scarce, and their once vaunted panzer divisions were shadows of their former selves. Against this backdrop, the Hellcat's sting was one more blow, a reminder that innovation and adaptability could defeat even the most formidable armored machines. And as the Reich crumbled, one lesson became clear: speed, more than armor, had shifted the balance. To truly understand why the Hellcat could humiliate German armor, we must peel back the layers of steel and examine its design. For at first glance, the M18 looked unimpressive. Its armor was wafer-thin, no thicker than a man's forearm in many places. Its turret was open to the sky, exposing the crew to rain, shrapnel, and sniper fire. Compared to the hulking Panthers or Tiger IIs, it seemed fragile, almost reckless. And yet this was precisely the point. The beating heart of the Hellcat was the Wright Continental R975 radial engine, a 9-cylinder gasoline powerhouse originally derived from aircraft designs. Producing 400 horsepower, it gave the 18-ton vehicle a staggering power-to-weight ratio of over 22 horsepower per ton. For comparison, the Panther, weighing nearly 45 tons, had just 15 horsepower per ton. Numbers alone tell the story. The Hellcat was not just faster, it was vastly more agile per pound of mass. This engine was married to a Torquematic transmission, a 3-speed automatic that simplified driving and maximized responsiveness. Crews could slam the throttle and feel immediate acceleration, without the gear-hunting delays common in German tanks. Many Hellcat veterans recalled the visceral thrill, the sudden roar, the kick of acceleration, the sensation of a steel beast leaping forward like a sports car. In fact, one mechanic joked, "It drives like a Buick with a cannon." Speed alone, however, would have been useless without control. That control came from the torsion bar suspension, a modern system that allowed smoother rides at high speeds across uneven ground. German tanks, with their interleaved road wheels, provided stability but at the cost of maintenance complexity and mud-clogging nightmares. The Hellcat suspension was simpler, lighter, and forgiving. It allowed gunners to fire on the move, something rare in World War II. A Panther crew often needed to halt to stabilize their optics. A Hellcat could dash, pivot, and still snap off a shot. And what of that shot? The Hellcat carried the M176mm gun, an upgrade from the 75mm that armed most Shermans. Firing armor-piercing ammunition, it could penetrate roughly 109mm of armor at 500 meters with standard rounds. Against the Panther's frontal glacis, this was marginal. But against side armor or from ambush angles, the 76mm was lethal. More importantly, the gun's light recoil and efficient breech meant a well-trained crew could fire 6 to 8 rounds per minute, rapid compared to the slower, heavier German 75mm and 88mm guns. Rate of fire mattered. In practice, a Hellcat might fire 3 shells in the time it took a Panther to fire 1. Combine this with constant movement, and German gunners found themselves always behind, always reacting, never dictating. Inside the turret, the crew of 5 worked in tight choreography. The commander called targets, often standing upright with binoculars exposed above the turret rim. The gunner focused through his sight, ready for the commander's terse command, "Up front." Fire. The loader kept the breech cycling, sweating as he shoved shell after shell into the chamber. The driver and assistant driver coordinated the machine's leaps and halts, bracing as the turret swung. All of it depended on training, and by 1944 American crews had drilled relentlessly. There was no illusion of comfort. In winter, snow whipped into the open turret. In summer, dust and heat made the metal sear to the touch. The roar of the radial engine vibrated through every bone. Exhaust fumes mingled with cordite smoke. It was not a place of safety but of purpose. The very exposure heightened the crew's awareness. They were not sealed inside a coffin of steel, they were perched on top of a speeding predator, alive to every sight and sound. Critics then and now often ask, why sacrifice armor so drastically? Why build a vehicle that could be destroyed by a single shell? The answer lies in philosophy. American doctrine, shaped by experience and industrial reality, decided not to match German tanks plate for plate. Instead, the U.S. bet on mobility, numbers, and coordination. Shermans provided the backbone. Tank destroyers like the Hellcat were specialized scalpels, fast, sharp, but delicate. They were never meant to replace tanks in every role. They were meant to exploit specific opportunities. And in those opportunities, the Hellcat excelled. Consider fuel consumption. The M18 could travel over 100 miles on a single tank of gas, far greater than most German counterparts, which guzzled fuel at alarming rates. This mattered in pursuit and exploitation, when units needed to race through breaches in enemy lines. A Panther might limp along, limited by scarce fuel, while Hellcats surged forward without hesitation. Then there was maintenance. German tanks, marvels of engineering, were also nightmares for field repairs. Crews cursed the complexity of overlapping wheels, the fragility of final drives, the difficulty of replacing transmissions in the field. The Hellcat, by contrast, was simpler. Its components were more accessible, its systems more forgiving. Field depots could swap engines quickly, and mechanics trained in American automotive shops adapted with ease. This translated into higher operational availability, more Hellcats ready to fight, fewer stuck in workshops. For German crews, facing a Hellcat felt like chasing a shadow. For American crews, driving one felt like controlling possibility. They knew their vehicle was fragile, but fragility bred a certain pride. It was a machine that demanded courage, demanded decisiveness. Hesitation meant death. Boldness meant survival. In that crucible, crews developed a confidence not in armor, but in each other and in the trust that if they moved fast enough, they could outthink and outmaneuver any foe. And in many ways, that was the genius of the M18. It was not just a machine but a mindset on tracks. By the spring of 1945, the tide of war in Europe was irreversible. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies were thundering toward Berlin. And yet, even in these final months, the Hellcat continued to carve out its place in battlefield memory. The Lorraine fog of 1944 had first exposed the German tankers to this new predator. The Ardennes forests had amplified their frustrations, with phantoms darting in and out of the mist. Now, as American units pressed into Germany itself, the Hellcat struck blows not only against German armor but against the very confidence of the Panzer Arm. Imagine a Panther crew near Kassel in April 1945. They had grown up on tales of invincibility, how German tanks were unmatched in armor and firepower. Their officers taught them to trust their thick frontal plates, to fight deliberate duels at long range. And yet across fields now scarred with shell holes, they saw the same familiar shape, a low-slung silhouette, racing, weaving, refusing to stay still. Before their turret could swing, shells slammed into their flank. A crew member later recalled bitterly in a post-war interview, "We were hunters, and suddenly we were hunted." This reversal of roles was devastating. German training had emphasized patience, precision, control. But against the Hellcat, control slipped away. The battlefield became chaos. Their carefully prepared gunnery tables and range charts meant little against an opponent who refused to remain a stationary target. The Hellcat, for its part, was not invincible. Losses mounted as German anti-tank guns, mines, and Panzerfaust teams exploited its vulnerability. American crews knew the danger of overconfidence. A careless move into a town, a moment's hesitation in open ground, and a single hit would ignite the thin armor. Veterans often described the sensation: the sharp crack of impact, the sudden spray of sparks, the acrid stench of gasoline igniting. Survival depended on bailing out quickly, sometimes under fire. And yet, despite these risks, the Hellcat's record remained impressive. Battalions that fielded it typically achieved kill ratios of more than 2 to 1 against German armor. This was not because the Hellcat was the most powerful machine. It was because it was used with imagination, ambushes, rapid redeployment, and the unrelenting rhythm of shoot, move, shoot again. In one of its final major actions, near Fulda in March 1945, the Hellcat again proved its worth. A column of German tanks attempted to delay the American advance. Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion struck from concealed tree lanes, firing and then vanishing before return fire could pin them down. Within hours, the German force was shattered, its survivors retreating in disarray. Reports note that only a handful of Hellcats were lost, while dozens of German vehicles lay smoking in the fields. It was not just the material losses that mattered. By this stage, German crews often entered combat already doubting their chances. Stories had spread of the fast American destroyer. Rumors exaggerated its speed to impossible levels. Some claimed it moved as quickly as trucks, others insisted it could climb slopes that defied tanks. In truth, the myth of the Hellcat sometimes frightened opponents more than the machine itself. American crews too felt that aura. Many described their confidence in the machine not as blind faith but as a calculated trust. They knew its weaknesses, they respected its fragility, but they also understood its gifts. That knowledge gave them an edge over German crews who still clung to outdated assumptions. When German engineers finally captured and tested an intact Hellcat in late 1944, the findings stunned them. The test report, preserved in archives, read like a confession of disbelief. The speeds were confirmed. The lightweight armor was explained. The aircraft-derived engine was identified. But the conclusion was clear. This was a vehicle designed around an alien doctrine, one that German thinking could not easily absorb. Their own designs, such as the Jag Panther or the King Tiger, were built for frontal duels of strength. The Hellcat refused those duels altogether. This doctrinal disconnect proved fatal. By the end of the war, German crews faced not only overwhelming Allied numbers but also opponents who exploited maneuver in ways they had not prepared for. The Hellcat symbolized that divergence. And so, as the American advance thundered deeper into Germany, the Hellcat left behind a trail not just of destroyed vehicles, but of shattered expectations. One German officer wrote in April 1945, "Our tanks are strong, but the enemy no longer fights us where we are strong. He moves like smoke, striking from angles we cannot answer." It was more than a tactical complaint. It was the admission of a collapsing worldview. For years, the German armored force had been the terror of Europe, its doctrine studied, its machines feared. Now, against an American vehicle that was lighter, thinner, seemingly reckless, they found themselves overmatched. Not because of brute force but because of imagination. The climax of this story is not measured in the final kilometers to Berlin, but in that realization. That a fragile, fast, unconventional machine could unseat the myth of German invulnerability. That speed could be armor. That agility could be lethality. And in that revelation lay the undoing of German armored pride. The guns finally fell silent in May 1945. Across Europe, the ruins of cities smoldered, and armored wrecks littered the roads that once carried advancing armies. Among those wrecks were Panthers, Tigers, Shermans, and yes, Hellcats, each a symbol of the clash between doctrine, industry, and imagination. The M18 Hellcat had entered the war late and in relatively small numbers. Fewer than 3,000 were built. By comparison, tens of thousands of Shermans rolled off American production lines. And yet, despite its limited presence, the Hellcat carved a legacy out of proportion to its scale. Why? Because it proved something simple yet revolutionary: speed could substitute for armor. When German officers tested a captured Hellcat and documented its staggering performance, they were forced to admit a bitter truth. Their doctrine had never considered such a possibility. They had trained to outshoot, outarmor, and outlast opponents, but not to be outmaneuvered at such velocity. One German analyst even concluded that the vehicle's effectiveness depends entirely on movement. What he saw as a weakness was in fact the Hellcat's greatest strength. In post-war years, armies around the world remembered this lesson. The United States abandoned the specific tank destroyer doctrine, but it absorbed the principle. Mobility could be protection in itself. Light, fast vehicles like the M41 Walker Bulldog and later reconnaissance vehicles carried the Hellcat's spirit into the Cold War. The Soviet Union emphasized speed with designs like the PT-76 amphibious tank. Western Europe built lighter, rapid-deploying vehicles for reconnaissance and support. Even today, wheeled gun platforms, Italian Centauros, American Strikers with 105mm cannons, echo the Hellcat's design philosophy: strike fast, don't linger, and don't let the enemy fight on their terms. But perhaps the most enduring lesson was psychological. 4 German tankers encountering the Hellcat was not just a tactical shock. It was a collapse of assumptions. They discovered that invulnerability was an illusion, that the battlefield could be reshaped not by bigger guns or thicker steel, but by daring innovation. In many ways, the Hellcat was a machine designed not to win duels but to rewrite the duel entirely. And for the men who crewed it, the Hellcat was both a source of pride and a constant reminder of danger. Veterans spoke of their tin can, their fragile, open-topped, paper-thin vehicle. Yet they also spoke of how it gave them a fighting chance, how its speed allowed them to escape ambushes, how its agility turned the hunter into the hunted. Many credited the Hellcat's velocity for saving their lives again and again. That is the paradox of the M18 Hellcat. It was one of the most vulnerable armored vehicles of the war, and yet it inspired unmatched confidence in those who drove it. When we look back today, the Hellcat stands not only as a weapon of war but as a metaphor for military imagination. It reminds us that history is not always written by the heaviest hammer. Sometimes, it is written by the fastest hand, the boldest move, the willingness to break the rules and fight differently. The German tankers never knew the Hellcat could reach 55 miles per hour, until it was already upon them. By the time they realized their doctrines were shattered, their machines were burning, and their war was slipping away. So what do we take from this? That innovation often comes from seeing the battlefield differently. That survival is not only about strength but about agility. And that history rewards those who dare to change the mathematics of combat. If you've stayed with us through this journey, across foggy fields in Lorraine, through the frozen woods of the Ardennes, into the final battles on German soil, you've seen how a single machine challenged one of the most feared armies of the 20th century. And now I'll ask you directly. If you found this story compelling, if you want more untold chapters of World War II brought to life in vivid detail, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Every week, we uncover stories that textbooks often skip. Machines, battles, and human experiences that shape the course of history. Hit that like button if you enjoyed today's deep dive, and share this video with a friend who loves history. Drop a comment below. What do you think was the most decisive feature of the Hellcat? Its speed, its tactics, or the courage of its crews? I'd love to hear your perspective. Because history is not just about numbers and machines. It is about lessons that echo across time. And the Hellcat's lesson still whispers today. Sometimes the best armor is not to be where the enemy is aiming. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for remembering with us. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and never stop exploring the past.